Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Western Civilization. Today, we are going to be looking at the early Republic. And specifically, we'll be looking at the Roman Republic from the years 509 BC to 133 BC. So grab a pen, a paper, a tablet, and a keyboard, and let's begin. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to explain how Rome's political and military system enabled its expansion beyond Italy, analyze the key factors in Rome's victory over Carthage and its emergence as a dominant Mediterranean power, assess the impact of the Punic Wars on Rome's military, economy, and society, and finally, understand how Rome's conquest of new territories began to reshape its traditional republican values and institutions. Okay. Well, we had been looking at the Hellenistic world most recently, and we saw how Greece's polis model began to fade and its civic institutions began to fray as popular participation began to decline. We saw how power moved into the hands of Hellenistic monarchies, many of these kings claiming semi-divine status and elevating themselves above their subjects. This was a government from the top down with limited broad citizen participation. We also saw how wars between the successor states began to drain resources and to leave them vulnerable to a new power rising in the West. And so now we turn to Rome. In this lecture, we'll see how Rome's path was different. Rome, unlike a Hellenistic monarchy or even a classical Greek polis, was built on a mixed system of government. It allowed broad citizen participation, but tended to be more flexible than traditional Greek city-states, allowing for new infusions of blood. It would have a system of war built on the collective strength of its citizens and capable of integrating non-Roman peoples into this system. And as we'll see with Rome, it's able to expand through inclusion rather than just conquest. And we'll see that it will be eventually able to defeat some of the greatest powers of the Mediterranean world. Expansion would make Rome just not a contender, but a challenger of even the greatest powers in the Hellenistic monarchy, in the Hellenistic world. Well, we're going to start with geography, as we often do. I would imagine most people will be able to find Italy on the map. Of course, Italy is shaped like a boot. It's this long peninsula that juts down into the Mediterranean, about 750 miles long. Now, we've mentioned it several times before, but the Mediterranean is like an ancient trade superhighway. People's goods, ideas move back and forth along this Mediterranean zone. And I think you can see that Italy's central location in this zone puts it at a great advantage. If this is the superhighway, Italy is right in the center of it. As we zoom in on the map of Italy itself, I think you'll see that it's quite a bit easier, or would be easier to unite than the Greek mainland. If you look at the Greek mainland over here, it's very, very mountainous. And while Italy does have a spine, the Apennine Mountains that go through it, it also has these big flat areas with plains. So this means Italy is going to be easier to unite, though not easy. And these big plains are going to mean that it produces lots of food, enough to feed the early Italian populations. Furthermore, I want to draw your attention to where Rome is located. If Italy is shaped like a boot or actually a long leg, Rome is basically right on the kneecap, right in the center of Italy, which is in the center of the Mediterranean. So in a sense, it's the center of a center. Rome isn't on the ocean, but it's close enough, and it has a navigable river, the Tiber, which allowed people to traverse as far into Italy as Rome, and then they would have to stop off because the river gets too shallow. And so any seaborne traffic would naturally stop at Rome. Also, the river gets narrow enough at Rome where you can have a bridgehead, and so it was a crossroads of sort, both by water and by land. Now, early Italy was a very diverse place, say Italy in the 700s BC. There were several different groups. The Romans themselves were part of a larger group of people called the Latins. But there were many others. There were Umbrians just to the north and east. One of their most implacable rivals, the Samnites. Celts to the north. And particularly significant, settled Greek populations in the lower part of southern Italy and in the island of Sicily. And these Greek peoples would undoubtedly have a big impact on the Romans, but not as big as this group up to the north. And this is the Etruscans. The Etruscans were an Italian urbanized people, and they were going to exercise great influence, especially on the early Romans. This area, Etruria, is nowadays called Tuscany, named after the Etruscans, and this is where you would find many of Italy's famous Renaissance cities like Florence, Siena, and Pisa. Well, the Romans had a foundation myth, as many people did. According to the Romans descended from a man by the name of Aeneas. And Aeneas is pictured here to the top left. And this is him fleeing the city of Troy. So according to this legend, which is found in Homer, and then later in some of the Roman writers, Aeneas was the only survivor of Troy. That's the city that was attacked by the Greeks and made famous by the Trojan horse. Well, according to this legend, Aeneas fled from the city of Troy. He bounced around the Mediterranean, having many adventures along the way, dipping over into Carthage briefly, and then finally settling in Latinium. Well, here Aeneas and his family settled down, and many generations went by. And a descendant of Aeneas, a woman by the name of Sylvia, was so beautiful, we are told, that she caught the unwanted attention of Mars. And as a result of this unwanted attention, she gave birth to two twins, Romulus and Remus. Now, in this legend, Romulus and Remus's evil uncle had been warned in a prophecy that they would become the leaders of the Roman people, and out of jealousy, he tried killing them by throwing them into a river. But according to the story, the two boys washed up and were suckled by a she-wolf. They grew, sought revenge on their evil uncle, and then quarreled themselves. Romulus killed Remus, and Romulus became the first ruler of Rome and the eponymous founder of the city. All right. So this is the Roman origin story. Now, much of early Roman history is shrouded in myth and legend. And this is certainly the case with Romulus, but even later. Even many of the traditions surrounding the founding of Rome's form of government that it would be known for, are written long after the fact. And so we're told that Rome would have 7 kings, Romulus being the first, but there were 7 others. Now, the last of these kings, a man by the name of Tarquin Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, was an evil king, we are told. He did some very evil things, angering the Roman upper classes, who drove him out and established a new form of government called a republic. We're told that this happened in the year 510 BC, which interestingly was the same year that Athens acquired its democracy. From this time onwards, though, the Romans would never again have a king, and the very idea of a king became obnoxious to the Roman people. And so what was this republic, or res publica as the Romans would call it? Well, the government is quite complicated, but let's try to simplify it. Basically, the republic was a mixed constitution, meaning that it had different branches of government. There was a branch that operated very much like a king. Kings, of course, in ancient times led troops into battle and also performed religious functions, and this was certainly the case with the consuls. These were the 2 leaders who were elected by the Romans to lead the army into battle. They were kind of like the Roman version of the commanders-in-chiefs. The Romans had great amount of respect for people who were old and people who had done great things. And so once someone had held high office for a while, like an ex-consul or other high position, when they were done holding their 1-year term, Roman magistrates were served for a year, they could then sit in the Senate, the other branch. And so the Senate was a repository of many of Rome's great men, previous generals or previous judges or other high-ranking officials. Also, they tended to be on the older side since you had to meet age requirements in Rome. Finally, all Roman citizens were allowed to participate in the popular assemblies. Now, I won't get into the details on how all of this actually worked together. I don't know that it's terribly important, but let's just suffice it to say, to get legislation passed, you needed to involve all 3 of these branches to one degree or another. And so this is what is called a mixed constitution. I want you to notice that it has something like a monarchy in it. This is a monarchical branch. The consuls, even though there's 2 of them, they operate much like monarchies do. There was also an aristocratic branch, an aristocratic element to it. Aristocrat just means rule by the best, right? And the Senate was certainly a repository of what the Romans thought was the best, ex-generals and lawgivers. And then finally, there was a democratic branch to it. The people of Rome as a whole needed to participate in government to elect officials and also to pass legislation. Now, this form of government was admired by later Greeks, particularly a Greek writer by the name of Polybus. And Polybus was fascinated by the Roman system because when he compared it to his native Greece, which always seemed to be in a state of strife, always in a state of revolution, he saw that the Roman system of government fared favorably. The Greeks believed in a cyclical view of history. They thought at some state in their history, people would eventually be a monarchy. But then the aristocracy, the wealthy leading citizens, would grow tired and they would have a revolution and overthrow the monarchy. Then the common people would get testy and want a share of the power, so there would be another revolution. But the Greeks tended to have a pretty dim view of the average person and thought that they wouldn't be smart enough to rule themselves and would soon devolve into factions. And then you would have anarchy, or no rule. That's all anarchy means, is no one rule it. But nature abhors a vacuum, and someone would have to come in and stop the anarchy. A strong man would arise, and we'd be back to monarchy. And so the Greeks tended to think of all of history as a continuous cycle of revolution, turmoil, bloodshed, and so on. Except the sneaky Romans had managed to find a way out of it, which, according to the Greeks, was one of the reasons they did so well. They seem to have this perfect system of government, combining the best elements of all of these. Well, the Romans probably would have agreed, but they probably would have put more stock in their values. The Romans believed strongly in an idea which they called the mos maiorum, or the ways of the ancestors. Later Romans would idealize the earlier Romans. They saw in their ancestors people who were selfless, who were disciplined, who were committed to duty, and put the state above private interests. And these became core Roman values. The Romans liked to idealize the small peasant farmer. In the Roman view, the peasant farmer was a person who lived simply, worked at his home. He would don the armor of a legionary when duty called, but then go back to his small family farm. And to the Romans, this was one of the ideals, to be the small peasant farmer, a citizen soldier who would sacrifice on behalf of Rome and stand up for its citizens. And the Romans also like to imagine that the early Roman aristocrats, the early Roman upper classes, were like this too. They would seek glory, but only seek glory by making Rome more glorious. They would not be self-serving and seek to enrich themselves at the expense of the Roman state. Now, undoubtedly, this was probably looking at the past with rose-colored glasses, but the Romans liked to think that this was what made them great, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, and they sought to emulate this. Now, despite how stable the government was of the early Roman Republic, we do know that there was social tension, which the Romans called the struggle of the orders. In ancient Rome, there were two orders of citizens. We could call them classes, although they're not really classes, because people were born into these ranks. There was an aristocratic upper class group called the patricians. They made up about 5 to 10% of the population. And then the other 90% of the free population were what are called plebeians. And the patricians would hog most of the higher offices. They excluded the plebes. Plebes were treated like second-class citizens. And this obviously upset the plebes, who like to point out that they did a lot of the work around Rome and were the vast majority of the soldiers in the army. Well, after getting nowhere, on several occasions we're told that the plebes seceded from Rome. That is, they left Rome and went to the nearby hills. Modern historians are a little divided on how factual this is, but there does seem to be an element of truth to this. Well, over the course of several centuries, the plebes were able to get concessions from the patricians. And this is significant. Because the patricians showed their willingness to include others into their system of government. Now, not all plebes were the same. As I said, they weren't really a class. They were more like a um, a caste, almost like a Hindu caste, where you're born into one particular group or another. And so, for the vast majority of plebes who were in fact poor, they just wanted their rights protected. They wanted land. And so the patricians agreed that the plebes could have their own special officers, the tribunes of the plebs. And these individuals would give protection to the plebes. They would they had the power to veto laws that were prejudicial against the plebes. And the patricians also agreed that the plebes could get land if they continued to fight in the army. Now, this was the case with lower class plebes, but there were quite a few plebes who were quite wealthy. And for these individuals, they wanted access to high office. They basically wanted to be part of the cool kid club. They had the money, but they didn't have the status. And so laws that had prohibited plebes from marrying patricians were struck down. Plebes were granted access to high office. And eventually what started to happen is the distinction between plebe and patrician started to break down. That is, upper-class plebes and patricians started to merge and move into the same circles and become a united class of sorts. There was still class differences, the lower-class plebes, but increasingly your birth didn't matter. And so these concessions were enough to keep both wealthy and upper-class plebes happy and willing to once again participate in Rome's conquests. And so, having worked out a reasonable compromise, the Romans began their conquest of the Mediterranean world. By 272 BC, Rome was the strongest power in Italy, controlling much of the peninsula. This put Rome in a new position. They now had many subject peoples underneath them. And Rome worked out a pretty ingenious way of dealing with these people. They created a hierarchy of rights and privileges. Now, at the very top were people who were full-fledged Roman citizens, people from Rome, essentially. They had another and these people were full citizen rights. They could vote, they could run for office, you name it, they could do it. Below that, though, they created a category called the Latin right. Initially, this was just for their Latin cousins, the people who lived near them, but it was even extended out to other groups. And these people were given the right to marry, to do business in Rome. They were given significant privileges, but not the right to vote necessarily in Roman elections. Below this, there was a category of allies. These are people who had sought out Rome's friendship and had gotten Rome's protection. And so they were allowed to conduct their own business and their own affairs, lead their own lives in their own communities, but they didn't have the same political rights as a full-fledged Roman or even the Latin right did. They had to supply troops to help Rome, but they could be assured of Rome's protection. And then finally, there was this category of subjugated people. These were people who had recently been outright hostile toward Rome, but had now been conquered. And these people had very few rights. They weren't regarded as citizens. They didn't have very much autonomy, and they could even be taxed pretty heavily by the Romans. The genius of the system, though, was that people weren't stuck in whatever category they found themselves in. In other words, there was the ability to move up category. And sometimes this was granted to individuals who were particularly helpful to the Romans, or sometimes even to whole communities. And so even if you were in one of these subjugated peoples categories, you could, if you played ball with the Romans, gradually go up the ladder and become full-fledged Roman citizens. And so the Romans found that this was a good system because it gave everybody some buy-in. All right. The Romans created this idea of political citizenship, which was very unique in the ancient world. For instance, in a Greek city-state, to be a citizen meant that you were essentially part of the family. You had strong ethnic ties to the other people. The Romans, though, create this political idea of citizenship. They'll give it to whom they want. They don't give it away to just anybody. You have to earn it. But the idea is that you can eventually be part of the Roman system. And the Romans more or less left people alone. They left their allies. They left the Latin cities alone. And people were given a lot of protection. People were given a share of the spoils. And this had a very important effect because all of these people were obligated by treaty to send troops to the Romans. And this would have a big effect on Rome's ability to project force, because each new conquest meant that there was probably going to be a new group of people coming into the Roman system. These people would start to provide troops for the Romans. They would send armies, and so the Roman army would get bigger, and then there would be more people sent out. And so this kind of had like a snowball effect. Pretty soon, the Romans were able to field armies that were absolutely massive, and that was because they were so generous with their ability to include people and extend the citizen rights. The Romans also practiced colonization, much like the Greeks did. You may remember that this was a Greek policy. And it has some similarities to the Greeks, but also some differences. In the case of the Romans, colonies were mostly made up of ex-military. So when Rome would conquer a new territory, they would set aside some of the land for soldiers, for plebes who wouldn't have very much land. And this had a benefit for Rome in a number of ways. For one, it helped buy the loyalty of the plebes, who, as you may remember, were recently in the struggle of the orders. So it had that benefit to reward this group. It also had the benefit of getting rid of the plebes. So you don't want Rome overcrowded with poor people, and so you send them out. And this kind of has some similarities with the Greek model. But unlike the Greek model, the Romans retained political control over its colonies. In other words, they didn't just cut them loose like the Greeks did. These people were still part of the Roman system. And so this had an advantage that as Rome grew and sent out more colonies, these people who were, for the most part, ex-military would set up little communities all across Italy. In time, hopefully, these communities would start to have relations with nearby communities. Maybe there would be intermarriages. Maybe children born from this would have Roman citizenship, even if they were from mixed marriages. And so this was another tool. And in the worst case, oftentimes Rome would put these in areas that were hostile. Well, now you've got a colony, you've got a community of Romans in an area that might not be so pacified yet. And so you have Roman boots on the ground who are going to keep an eye out on behalf of Rome. Well, between extension of citizenship and colonization, this policy was very effective because it meant that Italy was slowly Romanized. More and more of Italy began to adopt Latin. More and more of Italy began to see itself as Roman. And this process of consolidation came at a very important time because Rome was about to enter into one of its most dangerous clashes. And this was a clash with the Carthaginians. And so we can see Rome here in Italy, and just to the south of Rome in Sicily was Carthaginian territory, and also the islands off the coast of Italy. And Carthage itself was here in modern-day Tunisia, in northern Africa. And the Carthaginian Empire stretched all the way to Spain. And so this is a pretty large empire. These Carthaginians, by the way, were descended of the Phoenicians. And so the wars that are going to break out are known as the Punic Wars, because that's just the Latin version of the word Phoenician, the Puni, the Romans would call them. And so these people were one of those Phoenician colonies. You might remember the Phoenicians. They were one of these early seafaring people from the Near East, just above ancient Israel. And in a lot of ways, Carthage and Rome were two opposites. The Carthaginians, like their Phoenician ancestors, were a naval people. They were great traders. They were a wealthy society. The Carthaginians also tended to rely very heavily on slavery. So they had large fields of grain that they would cultivate and sell throughout the world, and much of this was worked by slaves. Carthage was run by a merchant oligarchy, some wealthy families. And so, in many ways, this is in stark contrast to Rome. Rome was a land-based power. It had a agrarian base, like the Carthaginians did, but this was worked mostly by free citizen labor. Rome had expanded through alliances with many of the Italian cities and had integrated many of these people. Rome had an army of citizen soldiers. And this is in contrast to the Carthaginians. Carthaginians didn't have a big citizen base, and so they tended to rely on mercenaries. And like Carthage, Rome did have a strong aristocracy, but it was also a much broader system of government, allowing for broader civic participation with its mixed constitution. Well, these wars are very fascinating, and unfortunately we won't have time to get into a ton about them. But I just want to draw the quick outlines. There were two major conflicts and then a third smaller one. But the First Punic War was fought over Sicily, which was pretty much right in between Italy and North Africa. This was fought in Sicily, but also there was quite a bit of naval skirmishing going on, which put Rome at a disadvantage because Rome was not a naval power, and put the Carthaginians at a great advantage because they were. Rome was able to overcome this deficiency, though, through its inventiveness. It created something called a corvus, which allowed them to level the playing field. Essentially, this was like a plank that would go down when a Roman ship was hit by a Carthaginian ship, and create like a bridge that would go over, allowing the Romans to board the Phoenician ship and commandeer it. A pretty ingenious invention. Well, this, in the Roman propensity to never give up, which was one of their traits, gradually ground down the Carthaginians. There was a brief period of peace. So the First Punic War lasts from 264 to 241. There's a brief period of peace. But then in 218, war starts up again. And this one is a much larger war, a much more dangerous war for the Romans, because this one involved the great Carthaginian general Hannibal, who you may have heard of. He's famous for marching his elephants through Spain, over barbarian territory, and across the Alps. A very audacious move. And Hannibal proved to be Rome's greatest threat because he was such a brilliant general that he was able to defeat the Romans on their home turf for like 17 years. For 17 years, Hannibal ravaged Italy, and the Romans were unable to defeat them. Well, fortunately for the Romans, they did have all of those allies. They had that big pool, manpower pool that they could draw from. This allowed them to not only keep Hannibal occupied, but eventually to start taking the war to Spain and to conquer Spain on behalf of Rome, and then eventually to North Africa itself. And in North Africa, they were by attacking the Carthaginian homeland, they were able to draw Hannibal away. And at the Battle of Zama, the Romans finally defeated Hannibal, bringing the Second War, Punic War, to an end. Well, this was a very significant development because with Carthage defeated, Rome was essentially the master of the Mediterranean world and was only growing. Why had Rome won this conflict? Well, part of Rome's success was its alliance system. Having all of these allies meant that it could field an army of 1 million people if it needed to. Now, it wouldn't do that all at once, but the Romans were able to just draw on this massive pool of citizens and allies, whereas Carthage was just forced to keep paying for mercenaries. Rome had proved to be militarily flexible, borrowing Carthaginian ideas and innovating them, like with its corvus and its naval technologies. Rome had also demonstrated its resilience. The Romans just never gave up. They were defeated many times, but kept getting up and gradually wore down the Carthaginians. And then finally, the Romans had been politically united. Even though Hannibal had hoped to peel off Roman allies, by this stage, many of these people saw their lot with Rome as better than their lot with Hannibal or as independent. The Romans had been good allies to these people, and so they stuck by Rome. And so, undoubtedly, as soldiers began to board their ships after the Battle of Zama in 202 and head back from North Africa, some of them may have thought about the history of Rome. Looking back the 500 years or so since its founding, Rome had gone from being a city to an Italian power. Its mixed form of government brought stability that was the envy of the classical world. It had a pragmatic government and a pragmatic system that allowed accommodation for the plebes and also accommodation for people who had been conquered or wished to ally with Rome. Rome spread the benefits broadly. And now Rome had its first overseas territories in Spain, North Africa, and Sicily, and was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean world at least, and soon the Mediterranean world as a whole. But some of these same soldiers boarding the ship, maybe some of the more thoughtful ones, would have saw things that might have given them reason to pause. Rome was now a mighty empire, but what would that mean for the average Roman? There were already voices calling for a conquest of Macedon and Greece. Many of these soldiers, if they thought about it, would have wondered what was happening back on their family farms. Hannibal had been in Italy for 16 or 17 years and had ravaged much of the countryside. Many of these farms would have been wasted. And perhaps these soldiers would have seen the Romans beginning to round up some of the Carthaginians as they had done the Spaniards, and to put them in chains and to lead them back to Italy. And maybe these soldiers would have wondered, where are these people going to go? Where will they work? And if they were particularly observant, they would have seen maybe some Roman aristocrats coming to Carthage, loading up ships full of plunder and full of wealth. Some of the more well-connected may have even been purchasing large plots of land from the Roman Senate to turn into large agricultural estates. And so, as these soldiers would have boarded their ship, they would have seen a Rome that was changing. But most of them were probably too satisfied with having defeated Hannibal and probably shrugged their shoulders and went on their way, and figured that Rome would probably work it out like it always had done before. And so next time we're going to see what will happen with Rome's overseas empire. We're going to see that the successive empire begins to tear the Roman political system apart. We'll see the rise of class tension and military strongmen. And we'll see as Rome begins to enter into civil war, dictatorship, and even the collapse of the Republic itself. And so, I will see you next time as we look at the early Republic.